Hello, and welcome to the Law Deals podcast, where we discuss law firm succession plans, profitable law partnerships, and law firm purchases and sales. I'm your host, Ed Alexander. I've practiced transactional business law for 30 years, have my own practice, Alexander Business Law, and am a principal with Fitzgibbon Alexander, a business intermediary firm. We're on a mission to make sales of law firms commonplace so you can enjoy your practice and your life. Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Law Deals podcast. Today I have Brian Glass of Great Legal Marketing and Ben Glass Law in Fairfax, Virginia. Welcome, Brian.
Hey, Ed, thanks for having me.
So, Brian, give the audience a little bit about your background and who you are.
Yeah, man. So I've been practicing law since 2008. I graduated into the teeth of the Great Recession, and I was one of these people that went to law school like with the promises of the $160,000 a year job, and my first job out of law school was like 60 or 65 at a general practice firm. So I decided that wasn't for me and moved into the auto accident space, where it really is much more eat what you kill, and there are more levers that you can pull to increase the amount of money that you're taking home every month. And so I practiced in Fairfax for about 10, 11 years at a firm where I became partner, and then in 2019 I left that firm and joined my dad's firm, Ben Glass Law, took over the auto accident section there, and then earlier this year, maybe late last year, stepped into Great Legal Marketing, which is our coaching and consulting and mastermind business, which you're a client of and I appreciate, where we teach solo and small law firm owners how to run better businesses, live better lives. And my whole thesis is like, you didn't go to law school and have all of this debt so that you could work 65, 70 hours a week and be a slave to somebody else. So I really think about this in terms of like, how do you build the practice you enjoy showing up to on Monday that you don't always look forward to going home from on Friday, and that serves your life rather than having to live a life that serves your legal practice?
Excellent. Well, I'd like to get into the part that you just mentioned about you coming into Ben Glass Law, right? And so you're Ben's son. So there's a number of things that go on with this transition, but as you know, we're about the succession planning piece, right? And so this is partly succession planning and partly an opportunity to grow the firm. So when it came time for this to happen, give me an idea of the process that you and Ben went through.
So here's the thing. Really, the impetus for this was in 2018. Really, three things happened. The firm that I was at, we lost an employee and we made a decision not to expand into the office space next to us. Ben's firm moved across town to a larger office space and had more room. And then my wife had a really difficult birth of our third child and ended up in the ICU. He was in the NICU for 10 days or so. And everybody's good now. But, my dad was 60, and that really was like a mortality check for me, where it's like, all right, if we ever want to practice together, we're in the same town. If we don't do it now, I'm thinking about committing to other office space. You've committed to other office space. Like this is the time to do it if we're ever going to do it. So that was the impetus for that decision. And I came over really without a plan. Like, I swear the original plan was, it was him. There was another guy who was a non-equity partner and me, and everybody took a little bit of a W-2 pay cut to make this deal happen initially. And the initial idea was like a 50, 25, 25 profit share split. And he took that home, and my mom was like, "What, you're giving away 50% of the equity in the business for nothing? Like, how did that happen?" So then we went down the rabbit hole of hey, we should talk to lawyers about this, because there's really nothing, and we're self-starters, self-educators, but there's not much on the internet, and I didn't know you at the time, and there's not much in the way of books that teaches lawyers how to evaluate their businesses and how to bring practices together. There's all this stuff for doctors. And so we started there. We said, what would a new associate doctor or whatever the term for that might be, what would it look like if they were buying into an orthopedic practice? And so our structure was something like, we took a multiple of the revenue of the current business and a multiple of the take-home pay of the owner, and kind of came to a number of what we think the business is worth. And then I kind of had an earn in. Like, we'll just make our salaries disparate until the time where I have paid in enough to be a 50% partner. The other guy left. So I brought a little bit of money to the table, but most of the deal was kind of an earn in. And we can get into it. But in hindsight, and like, we paid lawyers, I think, $25,000 to put this deal together. But they really gave us absolutely no business education. It was all about, well, what happens if one of you dies? What happens if somebody gets divorced? What happens if somebody is disabled? Those are all important things, but there's no education at all on, how do you actually evaluate this thing, and what does a real buy-in look like?
And the psychological aspect of it, right? Because there's really this component of, and this happens in all businesses, not just law firms, but at the end of the day, it's, I have this baby, right? And this concept of value is so tied to the view that I have of it. And I need an objective outsider to tell me what reality is. It's the reason people hire lawyers, right? The lawyer who represents himself or herself has a fool for a client. And that's the idea, is that this emotion in it just really wraps around your head. And oftentimes you can't get there. That's why you need that outside component. And it's correct. Most lawyers are really focused on, all right, well, what are the off ramps? How do we undo this thing if it doesn't work? And how do we deal with these contingencies that we've seen other people deal with, and we're trying to predict the future? So you ultimately come up with some value here, and you're looking at medical practices, which I guess in some extent is a little analogous, but they have a different structure most often with these outside organizations that are service organizations and that effectively run the practice, right? So tell me more about how that process unfolded.
So, yeah, I think it's analogous. The piece that we were missing with that is that most medical practices are branded. Like here you have Ortho Virginia. It's not Dr. Smith. And of course, with the law firm, you're not producing like widget. The next client that comes through the door really is highly dependent in most firms on the continued existence of the lawyer, because the lawyer's doing the marketing and the lawyer's sometimes doing the intake. And the lawyer is of course producing the product, right? So, we have these two verticals. We have the injury practice and we have this long-term disability practice. And one of the things that I didn't appreciate was that there were many more levers that could be pulled in the injury practice to increase the revenue very, very quickly. And that's what I'm good at, right? So in the first 3 years that I was here, we increased the revenue by 400% in that practice. Didn't have the same growth in the long-term disability because the way that our fee is structured, there's a long tail to it. Now, that creates a different opportunity, right? So in that practice, when we win a case, somebody comes on claim, and now all the claim checks come through our office into perpetuity until they are off claim. And so there's a recurring revenue model there, but on the front end, it's not there. Whereas in the auto accident practice, like if you can get a couple more cases, make them worth more money, and figure out how to run them through the system faster, you can really increase an underperforming firm. And so really what we did is we papered the deal back then and then kept like two sets of books, right? Because the other thing that we weren't educated on is, okay, in an S Corp, you actually can't split the profits at the end of the year. You've got to do 50-50. So we got there and we were like, well, okay, I guess I got to take a significant reduction in my weekly or biweekly paycheck in order to make that work.
So Brian, let me back up for a second, because you hit on a really important topic there, right? You called it the branding, right? And we call it enterprise value versus personal goodwill, right? Because and I always give the example of Olive Garden, right? So if you're in Virginia and you go to an Olive Garden, or you're in Florida and you got an Olive Garden, it's going to look the same. You're going to get the same exact meal. It's going to taste exactly the same, right? And so we don't care who's in the kitchen. We don't care who's serving the food. It's all about just working that model. So that would be the enterprise goodwill. And then on the other side is that personal goodwill, which is what we're talking about from a lawyer perspective, right? And so ultimately, that's going to drive a different risk factor that is applied to the revenue that's coming out. And so as you're improving this, you're improving the revenue, which is fantastic. But you were also improving the risk factors too, because you're diversifying the lead flow, aren't you?
Yeah. Yeah. So that was another thing that we did is we had a medical malpractice practice that we discontinued for risk reasons, right? What happened, I got in and I looked at the revenue in the section, and I don't know, in the last 2 years before I joined, 60 or 75% of the revenue, depending on which year you were looking at, came from one or two cases. And that scared me,
Oh,
right?
wow.
And in one year, it was like 60% of the revenue came from one medical malpractice case, which in Virginia, like those are a coin flip. They never settle, at least in our experience. They weren't settling pre-suit and they weren't settling litigation. And it costs $100,000 to take those
Yeah.
to trial.
Yeah. Wow.
So the risk profile did not look good. And so, but the limiting belief that they had at the time, we can't run or don't want to be a more volume based auto accident practice. And I had come from a more volume based auto accident practice. And I said, well, there's a way to bring in and to add value to these cases that have $10,000 or $15,000 fees and just pump them out, right? And what if we could add 6 or 8 of those kinds of cases every month? How would that change the risk profile? The problem that most personal injury lawyers have is that our income is incredibly lumpy, and you might have a big hit in September and then nothing else again until January. So you have to leave a lot of money in the business. So we diversified the income model by bringing in those smaller dollar cases and still drawing a distinction of, listen, I'm not going to take an emergency room only case because it takes too much effort on our part to produce that case for not enough value, and it's not giving enough value to the client. So we drew a distinction around, here's the cases that we actually feel like are mutually beneficial to the client. But they had never run that model, and it's what I grew up on. So yeah, so we diversified and kind of de-risked the cash flow from that perspective.
So I think the important part here, right, is as I look at these, and I just have a different view, right? I look at there are 3 types of law firms in the entire world. There are brain surgery firms, so these are bet the farm type issues. There are relationship firms, and those would be like commercial litigation, important work, but it's more about the ongoing relationship that you have with the client. And then there are more process oriented firms, so higher volume oriented firms. And the higher volume oriented firms have a lower risk profile because it's all about the marketing and it's all about the processing, right? So we're not reliant on any one attorney to be the guru, which we have in the brain surgery arrangement. And to some extent, you have that in the relationship arrangement as well. So in that process, you're increasing value substantially. So although the revenue went up, the value probably went up by a factor greater than the revenue increase because of this move to being able to handle cases faster, getting that revenue going, and I guess delumping. I like that. I'm going to use that again. Delumping the income out of the firm.
Yeah, and the thing that I would say is I think we're somewhere between law firm number 2 and law firm number 3. Once the cases are in the door, there's a process that runs them. But I think about us really as a relationship firm, because one of the things that we know from having good data on our lead flow is 65% of our cases and 80% of our money come from referral relationships, not from Google, not from pay-per-click ads, but from referrals. And so, what you said about it's a transactional corporate relationship with the client, I just kind of flip that. And I think not necessarily with the client, but with the referral sources. Mm-hmm. So where are my cases coming from medical doctors or from, connections that we have in the broader community? And we do I think a really good job of maintaining those relationships via print newsletter and email newsletter, and then, a little bit of social media on the back end, but understanding that you can be a hybrid of the 3 models that you talked about. If you just flip the switch from, performing the work for the client to servicing and providing value to your marketing or referral sources also.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So we got off on a little bit of a tangent. So let's go back to the buy-in process. So let's continue forward. So you're buying in, you come up with a price, you ultimately make the buy-in, and then you've come up with this issue. Okay, well, we can only make distributions in accordance with ownership interest per the S Corp rules. And so in the past, what we've done is basically created a bonus structure. It's not tax efficient, but that's ultimately the way we have to do it. to accommodate that. How did you ultimately come up with the correct allocation?
I was just making a lower salary, also not tax efficient, right? And it's kind of the flip side of doing it bonus wise. But the other problem that we ran into, Ed, was, all of these little owner benefit things that that you want to run through the business, masterminds, trips that are connected to traveling to conferences and all of those things, and trying to figure out like, okay, what's a fair way to do that? And so in the early days, we were kind of keeping this side ledger of an entrepreneurial mastermind that I'm in, and some tax expertise advice that he was getting, and car for the business on one side. So we were kind of keeping that back of the napkin stuff. We ultimately got to the point where the PI section had done so well and it produced so much more money that we just kind of looked at each other and said, well, you just want to call it even? Because it was such a headache trying to keep these two sets of books that it was just really not worth it anymore. And we've done very well over the last 5 years. And the difficulty that I have, kind of going forward is he's 65, right? And so he still owns 50% of the business. And that's either going to look like I'm going to buy the other 50%, or I got to find somebody, to buy it. And then of course he's running that part of the business that actually produces recurring cash flow without us having to really do a whole lot extra work. Like the average fee of the lifetime of the client is roughly the same in either vertical, just the tail is different.
Right.
And so I've got to think about in the next couple of years, like what would be the best thing for him and for me in terms of structuring the buyout? How does he do that in a tax efficient way that also reduces the risk of, you sell it to a lawyer on an earn out, fee share or something, and then the lawyer decides 2 years and he doesn't want to do it anymore.
Yeah.
There's that risk also.
Yeah, right. Exactly. From that perspective, I mean, really, the discounted cash flow is really going to work the best, I think, because you've got a pretty well-known flow of income. And then, I think there might be a factor, right? If somebody passes or something like that, the income goes away, I would imagine. So you've got to deal with those issues. So the good news is I think that's probably a math problem. But I think Ben has said he doesn't ever want to retire. So that might be the bigger issue that you guys have.
Retire is different than perform legal work.
There you go.
So that's the other thing that I think so many lawyers never think about as they're building their practices is, all right, if I'm at the point where I'm paying myself a quote salary, how much of that salary is for the work that I am doing as the lawyer? How much of it is for I'm running the business? And how much of it is just like, this is the percentage of my annual take home that I'm comfortable with taking every 2 weeks or every month, right? And then when it comes time to grow, instead of thinking about I'm offloading this $120,000 or $150,000 of salary because I'm not performing the legal work anymore, we go, I've got to go and find more revenue to come in before I can afford the next lawyer. And so I've heard you on a couple of episodes talking about the compensation plan, how you kind of emotionally detach yourself from the amount of money that's coming in and recognize, like, what is this company paying me to perform on a week in and a week out basis? And do I like doing it? Or should the company be paying somebody else to do it? And then I need to figure out another way to make more money as the owner or the operator of the actual business.
Yeah, that psychological issue comes down to two things. The one that I find people really have the biggest hurdle of overcoming is this issue of I am a lawyer, I do the best work, right? And so that kind of, wanting to be the best and I am the best and being recognized for doing that versus being a business owner. So that's one. And then the second to me is failing to see that by giving somebody else work, I'm making money as profit instead of making money through my labor. And that if you look at any business, I mean, at the end of the day, that is what makes the business valuable is that cash flow from profit, right? Rather than working in it. The worst example that I've seen of this are people who call and they say, well, I work 60 hours a week, or I work, 65 hours a week, and I bill whatever, come up with some crazy number, 2,000 hours a year. And, and they think that in some way somebody's going to come in and buy that practice and want to work 60 hours a week just like that person did. And it just isn't there, right? I mean, you got to adjust that practice to reflect that that person's working two jobs, not one. And therefore, they're not going to get the benefit of it because somebody's going to come in and hire somebody to perform half that work, and they're going to perform the other half of that work. So, yeah, it is an interesting conundrum for lawyers in particular. I don't think the doctors suffer that at all.
Exactly right, because there's somebody told me maybe a year ago the proverb of the wealthy dentist. Do you know this?
I do not.
So you go to a dental practice and you've been going there 17 years or whatever, and you show up one Tuesday to get your teeth cleaned and it's a different dentist. You don't even notice because you don't have the relationship with the dentist. You have the relationship with the practice. I think it's different for lawyers, or at least lawyers think it's different, right? Because when somebody leaves, what if we train them to be great and they leave? They can take cases with us and often do take cases with them because the client has a more direct relationship with the person who's actually performing the work. And so what you need to think about as the owner, as you start to have other people coming in and out and doing the work, is how do you continue to maintain the relationship with the clients so you at least give them an option, right? At least make it enticing to want to stay with you, the actual expert. And how do you create your branding? It's a different problem, right? Because you create the branding around you. Now you have a sales problem on the back end. But also, how do you create an environment where your employees are happy and then they don't want to leave, right? And so if you could solve that problem, you would have much less stress about having somebody come in and actually being a better lawyer than you are, because you could be a better business owner and solve the problem for them if they don't want to learn marketing or they don't want to manage people. They just want to be a great lawyer. But most lawyers have been high achievers all their life and they want to be great at everything. And it's really difficult to be great at everything in less than 60 or 70 hours a week.
Right. So with the new FTC rule, so there's a new FTC non-compete rule out there, other businesses might be facing this issue as well. And kind of, my view of it is that at the end of the day, people are going to leave. And at the end of the day, people are going to try and compete with you, right? But if you've built a practice where you just said the branding, right? So where you've got this enterprise goodwill, where you have a team approach to everything. So it's not just a lawyer who's communicating with the client. It's the lawyer, it's the support staff, it's the owner, right? So there's this ongoing communication from the team. The fact that that person leaves, I think, is minimized in that type of scenario, right? And especially if you build your marketing around you so that the world knows you as the head of that practice, right? And then I agree with you. To some extent, it can cause some problems. But when you transfer the practice, there can be a transition period, and should be actually, where the lawyer selling the practice remains of counsel with the buyer and actually participates to some extent, not a lot, but participates to some extent. Keep that face out in front of the public as part of the firm. And to the extent that clients want to talk to that person, be available to talk to that person. That increases value because it reduces risk. And at the end of the day, it also reduces the risk when people leave, like you're talking about.
Really, the problem that most lawyers are trying to solve for when they sell their firms is, I don't want to do this anymore and I want to go do something else. But the reality is that the firms that we're running have probably the highest profit margins of almost any other business that you could run. So unless you're going to go perform a job for somebody else, like going and buying, I don't know, a chain of car washes or going into real estate, like, it's probably not a better return for your dollars. And then the challenge is, well, how do I create the firm for myself where I'm only working on the things that I'm really good at and that actually bring me a lot of joy and make me excited to show up on Monday morning? And how do I attract staff that I'm excited to see on Monday?
Yeah, the crazy profitability is what is attracting private equity, right? I mean, at the end of the day, they see those numbers and they go, hey, what other business can we be in that produces these kinds of returns on investment? pretty dramatic. So that's absolutely true.
Mm-hmm.
So good. So, all right, let's just go back. You come into the practice and you're kind of new man on the block. Plus, all of a sudden you go and you're an owner. And at the same time, you're the son of the founder. So you have two issues that basically cause problems in most business relationships. How did you overcome those? How did you deal with those?
Left. I mean, yeah. So you come in and you change the way that we've done things, and I got accused of being too corporate-y, and my response is like, that was over a case where we had a $90,000 fee. And I asked 3 times over the course of 3 weeks, like, hey, we settled that case. Is the check here yet? Why isn't the check here yet? What have you done to make sure that the check is coming in tomorrow? Right? Because we have to make payroll. So when you come in and you change the culture in that way, not everybody's always going to be happy. When I came in, we were small, probably had 8 people. So yeah, I mean, listen, it happens. You just have to accept that culture is going to change, and that what's good for you isn't always going to be good for everybody else. But there are people out there who want to work in that environment, and you can just attract new talent. The other thing that we did, Ed, is we started in 2019 or 2020 running on EOS and having a real structure around our meetings and around what kind of firm do we want to be and what are our 3-year goals. And that really got us closer to, everybody who's on the leadership page being on the same team about what are we building, what are the core values, and are there people in the organization that don't fit the core values? And if so, what do we do with them? We were having, when I started, a whole lot of these like flyby meetings and side conversations, and that solved for that. So whether it's EOS or some other kind of business structure, having outside accountability and outside framework for how you're operating and making decisions is really, really helpful.
Excellent. Well, so I just wanted to get a little bit of background information about you that we didn't really talk about before. I know that you're an ultra runner, and you and I have talked a little bit about this in the past. I always wondered how you ran.
Will be again. Yeah.
Oh, there you go. I always wondered how you ran 100 miles, but I'd love to hear what you did there.
Sure. So I got into running when I was in law school, and when I first started it was like just looking for something to do. My first year of law school was at Michigan State, and right next to the law school was some gym that had I think it was a 1/9 or a 1/11 of a mile indoor track, right? So just unbelievably boring, no windows. But I had a group of buddies, and we'd go over there and we'd run. I'm not sure if this is PC to call anymore, but we called them Indian runs, right? So 4 or 5 of us jogging, and then somebody would take off from the front and catch everybody from behind. So we did that on a regular basis. I got into marathon running. I hit a point where I wasn't getting any faster. And frankly, marathons are hard because you're running hard the whole time. And so I just started running longer stuff. I read the book Born to Run, which is by Chris McDougall, and about how humans are, genetically engineered to be able to endurance run over very, very long distances. And I just built up, well, what if I could run 50K or for 12 hours or 50 mile or 24 hours, and then ultimately I landed on 100. So I've done 100-mile race that I finished in 23 hours and some change. And then I ran a 70-mile trail race a couple of years later. And then when I turned 38, I ran a 12-hour race with a goal of running 38 miles to prove to myself that I could still do it. But now I got 3 boys that are under the age of 11. It's just, I can't mortgage my Saturdays and Sundays to go out and train for 6 hours and come back and take a nap. So I've been running Spartan races recently. I do CrossFit, do pull-ups, whatever, and then you go and you run. So the most recent race that I ran was in Greece. Actually, it was the Spartan Race World Championships in Sparta with a group of friends. That was an awesome event and an awesome scenery. Now, how do you do it? One step at a time and very slowly. I was never fast, but I could go for a long time. And for me, it's meditative, right? It's like the trail running is, you have to focus on the next 5 or 10 feet directly in front of your face. Mm-hmm. And so that's my thinking time.
That's fantastic. That's exactly why I bike all the time. It's thinking time, right? Other than dodging vehicles, it's usually a lot of fun. Well, good. You had mentioned we're clients of GLM. We participate in the Hero Mastermind group, and I know that we've got the summit coming up. So why don't you tell the audience about the summit, how they can get information, and why they should come? And I will absolutely endorse them coming.
Cool. So there's a conference for lawyers every other week, right? There's tons of these things that you can go to. We think that we are the best conference for a solo and a small law firm owner who's doing somewhere between $500,000 and $2 million in revenue, right? If you are competing and trying to figure out, how do I spend my next advertising dollar? Right? Is it Google PPC? Is it LSAs? Is it maybe advertising on TV? There are plenty of places where you can go and learn that stuff. We really teach how to use referral marketing, how to not spend a ton of money on client and customer acquisition. The digital marketing is there. It's a nice piece. But we really teach how do you do it in a sustainable relationship way that doesn't end up in, tens of thousands of dollars in credit card charges to acquire clients every single month, because all this stuff changes. And then we focus on, how do you dial in your intake so that when you are spending that money, you are not losing clients out through the bottom of the bucket. So the best entry point for somebody, if they're interested in learning more, is to come out to our summit. It's going to be in Arizona from October 3rd through the 5th this year. And if you go to glmsummitnotes.com, you can grab the professionally transcribed notes of the 2023 summit, review them, see if that's up your alley. If it is, come join us in October.
Excellent. Any last words?
Last words. I don't know. So my whole thing is, this should be fun, right? You graduate law school when you're 25, like I did. You have 40 years ahead of you to work. I think there's this whole retire early movement. And I know people that have the ability to retire, but none of them have, because you'd be bored sitting on a beach and doing something. And so, I think, having watched a number of people try to build law firms that they could selling a law firm it's awesome. And it's an important thing to be able to do at some point, right? You have to think about, what would you do if I did? And how can I build a place where I actually want to work?
At the end of the day, even if you want to practice forever, you got to have a succession plan, right? Because otherwise you're leaving a mess for your heirs, right? It's just a complete mess. When a lawyer dies and they haven't thought about this stuff and people have to come in and pick up the pieces, it's a disaster, right? So you got to have a succession plan, even if you want to practice forever. But the other part of that is creating the firm of your dreams, right? And I've told this story before, but I'll tell it really quickly, right? So my daughter is lawyer Britt. She has her own firm in South Florida. And, she came to me, I guess, senior year of college, and we were talking about what she was going to do when she graduated college. And I suggested law school. And, she ultimately did go to law school. And then I told my friends, and they were like, "What, are you nuts? Do you not love your daughter?" And I just couldn't understand it. And I figured it out. I practice in a way that works for me. I practice in an environment that I created that works for me. Now, are there things to improve? Absolutely, 100%. There are always things to improve. But at the end of the day, if you figure out how you want to practice, this is a fantastic profession. And so, if you want to sell and it's not working for you, or, at some point people become too old and they need to sell, right? I get it. That's perfectly fine. But at the end of the day, make the practice work for you and have something that you like going to day in and day out.
You hit on a really important point there, which is, giving yourself options. And so, listen, you don't know what the world looks like in 3 or 5 or 7 years, or whether you want to exit your firm, but you need to do things today to set your firm up so that if you make that decision, you're not committing to selling it in 3 or 5 or 7 years. But if you haven't done the things like cleaning up your discretionary earnings, or setting up systems, or having good marketing systems or intake that you're not involved in, then you're not going to be able to sell it, at least not for what you think it's worth. And so, the succession planning is really important, as is just learning how to run this thing as a business, which most lawyers have never even considered.
And everything you do to improve value today for that sale or for the succession, is just making your life better, either in terms of income or in terms of time out of the office or in terms of less stress. Thank you very much for joining us on the Law Deals podcast. I appreciate your time.